Sometimes you grow up believing you know everything about the people you love. You hear their stories, you watch them build their lives, you sit at their table year after year thinking you understand who they are, what they've been through. But then one day, they're gone. And in the silence they leave behind, you find pieces of them you never knew existed. Pieces that don't fit the version you carried for years. That's when you realize the person you loved most was living with a truth they never dared to share. And once that truth surfaces, it tears everything apart. Enjoy the story. My grandfather was larger than life. In our family, he wasn't just respected, he was worshipped. The man who built everything from nothing. The man who stood tall when others fell. His name was carved onto office buildings, schools, foundations. Entire streets bore his name. At every family gathering, he sat at the head of the table, his booming voice filling the room as we hung on to his every word. We were raised beneath his shadow, beneath his success, beneath the image of strength he projected so effortlessly. My father and uncles lived their entire lives chasing his approval, trying to live up to the impossible standard he set. And we, the grandchildren, inherited that quiet pressure, the silent expectation to carry the name forward, never falter, never disappoint. But none of us ever asked him what it cost to carry that weight. When he died, the entire city seemed to mourn. Newspapers ran multi-page tributes. Business leaders gave tearful speeches. The funeral was a grand event filled with dignitaries, celebrities, and political leaders. The cameras captured our grief, but none of them saw what was already bubbling beneath the surface. Because in our family, grief always came tangled with something else, expectation. And behind closed doors, that expectation was simple. Now we take control of the empire. 2 days after the funeral, we gathered at the estate. The reading of the will, the moment every member of my family had silently anticipated for years. My uncles whispered to each other with quiet confidence, already dividing in their minds the pieces they believed belonged to them. My cousins smiled politely, their eyes calculating. My father sat stiff, unreadable as always, but I could feel the tension radiating off him. My mother squeezed his hand gently, her face pale, and I sat in the back, trying to quiet the growing unease in my stomach. The attorney, Mr. Adler, stood before us, a tall man with cold, practiced detachment. He had served my grandfather for decades, and he approached this reading like a surgeon, preparing for delicate work. At first, everything was as expected. The estate was divided with mathematical precision. Properties, businesses, charitable trusts, all assigned neatly to my father, my uncles, my cousins. Educational funds established, foundations maintained. The empire would continue, its structure intact. My family exchanged small nods of satisfaction. The machine was working exactly as they believed it would. And then Adler paused. A pause that didn't belong. His eyes lifted from the papers, scanning the room slowly. That pause was the crack before the earthquake. However, Adler said, his voice lowering slightly, there remains one final provision not previously disclosed in any public documentation. The air shifted instantly. The smiles faded. My uncles leaned forward. My cousins exchanged nervous glances. My father's jaw clenched. Everyone sensed it. Something was wrong. For the past 20 years, Adler continued, your father, Mr. Whitmore, managed a separate personal portfolio entirely independent of the primary estate. This portfolio consists of private offshore accounts, unlisted real estate holdings, and a variety of privately controlled assets. Its total estimated value is $112 million. The words detonated like a bomb in the room. $112 million? My cousin choked. What separate portfolio? My uncle demanded. My father's face went ghostly pale. Adler remained perfectly still. These assets were accumulated quietly without public disclosure and managed through private intermediaries. And who? My aunt snapped, her voice shaking. Is the beneficiary? Adler looked up again. The sole beneficiary of this portfolio is a woman named Claire Donovan. The room exploded into chaos. The shouting grew louder with every passing second. My uncles stood from their chairs, voices overlapping, throwing accusations like daggers into the air. "A mistress!" one of them barked. "It's blackmail," hissed another. My aunt demanded to see every document. My cousins muttered frantically, their carefully rehearsed visions of their inheritance crumbling before their eyes. Even my mother, normally composed and quiet, pressed her trembling hand against her mouth. Only my father remained seated, his eyes locked on Adler, though I could see the storm raging behind his gaze. His entire world, the empire he spent his life worshipping, was now tainted by a name none of us had ever heard before: Claire Donovan. The name itself seemed to hang in the air like smoke, suffocating, invasive. Who was she? Why had we never heard of her? And why, after a lifetime of preaching loyalty, family, and legacy, had my grandfather given her everything? Adler waited patiently for the outburst to die down, his voice slicing through the tension like a blade when he finally spoke again. All transfers were conducted legally and voluntarily over the course of 2 decades. Mr. Whitmore authorized every transaction in full capacity. There are no irregularities. The documentation is airtight. "Where is this woman?" my uncle spat. "She needs to answer for this." "She's not family," my cousin growled. "She had no right." But their rage wasn't really about her. Not yet. It was about him. About the man they thought they knew. The man who spent years hiding this part of his life from everyone sitting in that room. I sat frozen, watching as the empire my grandfather built, not the financial one, but the illusion of unity and loyalty, began to fracture in real time. This wasn't just about money. It was about identity, about betrayal, about the unbearable realization that the man we idolized had lived with a secret none of us were ever trusted to carry. For the next several hours, the estate became a war room. Legal advisors were called, private investigators hired, PR consultants whispered strategies into ears. My uncles were already plotting how to challenge the transfers in court. The narrative was taking shape before the facts were even fully known. She manipulated him. She preyed on his loneliness. She stole what was rightfully ours. But beneath the noise, I couldn't shake the quiet unease gnawing at me. I couldn't see the predator they were so desperate to imagine. My grandfather had been many things: calculating, ambitious, fiercely protective of the family's reputation, but not weak, not easily controlled. Whatever this was, it wasn't simple. That night, I couldn't sleep. My mind replayed every holiday dinner, every lecture he gave us about honor, every time he reminded us that family was the only true wealth. And yet, here we were, facing a truth none of us wanted to acknowledge. He hadn't trusted us. He had built an entire part of his life, an entire fortune, outside the family, quietly, deliberately, and the deeper question kept clawing at me. Why? What was he hiding? And who exactly was Claire Donovan to him? The following morning, my family was already mobilizing like an army preparing for battle. My uncles sat in the estate's conference room surrounded by stacks of legal paperwork, barking orders at lawyers who scribbled furiously. Private investigators paced back and forth, delivering early fragments of information. I stood quietly at the edge of the room, listening to the storm unfold. They didn't want the truth. They wanted ammunition. "We'll destroy her in court," my uncle declared. "We'll prove she manipulated him. Elder abuse, financial coercion, whatever it takes. She's a parasite," my aunt seethed. This woman saw a vulnerable, old man and latched on. The investigator flipped open a folder. Her name is Claire Donovan, age 65, never married, no criminal record, no history of lawsuits or financial fraud, modest background, private financial advisor for small, independent clients, retired 5 years ago. "That's it?" my cousin snapped. "She's lived quietly in the same house for over 20 years, the investigator continued. "No luxury vehicles, no offshore properties in her name, nothing excessive or suspicious." "Of course not," my uncle hissed. "That's how smart predators operate." They were desperate to build a monster where none existed, but the absence of scandal only made their fury grow. It was easier to believe she was a fraud than to confront the alternative. that my grandfather had made these choices willingly, that he had trusted someone else with his deepest vulnerability. "I want her subpoenaed immediately," my uncle ordered. My father finally spoke for the first time that morning. His voice was quieter but darker. "No, not yet." Everyone turned to him, surprised. "We need to control the narrative first. If she talks, if she gets ahead of us in the media, we lose control. But if we don't act fast," my cousin started. "She won't talk," my father interrupted. "Not yet. She stayed quiet this long. She won't risk exposing herself now." I realized in that moment how cold my father had become. He wasn't thinking like a son grieving his father. He was thinking like a strategist protecting his own image. And beneath it all, I saw the same thing I saw in the others. It wasn't fear of losing money. It was fear of losing the version of my grandfather they had built inside themselves. They needed him to be flawless, because if he could fall, so could they. As the meeting spiraled into more legal positioning, I slipped away. I couldn't listen anymore. The greed was suffocating. The lies they were constructing weren't for the public, they were for themselves. A desperate attempt to avoid the truth staring them in the face. That evening, as the house grew quiet, I sat alone in my grandfather's study. The heavy scent of old leather, wood polish, and fading cigar smoke filled the room. His portrait loomed above me, that familiar smile frozen in oil and canvas. I whispered aloud into the silence, "Why her? Why not us?" And deep inside, I already feared the answer, because we never allowed him to be human. I couldn't sit back and watch them dismantle her life without knowing the truth for myself. Their narrative was growing more vicious by the hour, but something inside me resisted the picture they were painting. My grandfather wasn't weak. He wasn't easily deceived. He built his empire by reading people, by knowing who to trust and who to destroy. And yet, for 20 years, he had trusted this woman in absolute secrecy. That wasn't manipulation. That was intentional. And if I wanted answers, I had to hear them from her directly. The investigator provided me her address. It surprised me how close she lived. Not hidden away in some luxurious estate on a private island, but right here, in a modest suburban neighborhood. The drive was short, but my mind spun in endless loops as I approached her street. Every scenario played out in my head: a scheming woman feigning innocence, an opportunist masking guilt with grace, or perhaps something far more complicated. Her house was unremarkable. A small single-story home with a well-maintained garden, a white picket fence, and a simple front porch decorated with potted flowers. It didn't scream wealth. It didn't scream scandal. It whispered normalcy. I sat in my car for a few moments, gathering my breath, my pulse racing. And then, finally, I stepped out and walked toward the door. Before I could knock, it opened. She stood there, as if she had been expecting me. Claire Donovan. She looked nothing like the villain my family had conjured. Her silver hair was neatly pulled back. Her eyes were soft but steady. No fear, no arrogance, just calm acceptance. She wore a simple gray sweater, her hands folded gently in front of her. "You must be Nathan," she said softly, her voice warm, almost maternal. The sound of my name in her mouth startled me. "How do you know who I am?" "Because your grandfather spoke of you often." Her answer struck me like a wave. I hadn't expected that. I was prepared for lies, for evasions, but her words carried no defensiveness, only sadness. "I need to speak with you," I managed to say. She nodded without hesitation. "Please, come in." Her living room was small and quiet, filled with books, soft lighting, and photographs of people I didn't recognize. No signs of luxury, no excessive wealth. It looked like any ordinary home. She gestured for me to sit, and for a moment we simply stared at each other. Two strangers connected by the man who had shaped both of our lives in such profoundly different ways. I broke the silence. My voice was trembling, though I tried to steady it. "Who were you to my grandfather?" Her eyes didn't waver. She spoke gently, but with painful honesty. "I was his friend." "Friend?" My voice cracked. "He gave you everything." She lowered her gaze briefly, then returned her eyes to mine. Not everything, just the part of himself he couldn't share with anyone else. The room felt heavier. My throat tightened. I whispered, "I don't understand." "You will," she said softly. "But you have to be willing to hear the truth most people in your family are too afraid to face." I nodded, unable to speak. I was ready, even if I didn't know what I was ready for. And then she began. Her voice was soft, but every word landed like a stone on my chest. She spoke slowly, as though carefully peeling away layers of a wound that had never fully healed. "Your grandfather came to me long before his empire was complete. Long before the world saw him as the man you all admired. What you saw, what your family still clings to, is the version he built after the fall. But before that," she paused, her breath catching. "Before that, he was drowning." I shook my head, struggling to reconcile her words with the image burned into my mind since childhood. He was always in control. Always. She smiled sadly. "No one is always in control, Nathan. Not even men like him." I sat there frozen, barely breathing as she continued. "His ambition drove him into dangerous partnerships, investments that soured, loans that spiraled. He hid it from everyone. Your father, your uncles, even your grandmother. He believed he could fix it quietly until one day he realized the hole was deeper than he could climb out of. And that's when he found me." She paused again, studying my face, as though gauging whether I could handle what came next. "I didn't know who he was at first. He came to me through an intermediary. Desperate, humiliated. I was a private financial advisor back then. I worked with small business owners in crisis. He wasn't looking for charity. He was looking for salvation." My heart pounded. The man I idolized reduced to desperation. It was almost too much to accept. "I helped him stabilize everything," she continued. "I restructured debts, negotiated settlements quietly. He paid back every dollar he owed and every service I provided. But even after his empire was secure again, the shame never left him. He believed in his heart that without my help, the empire you all inherited would never have existed. And that guilt, it grew." I swallowed hard, the room closing in around me. He couldn't bear to tell his family that he almost lost everything, not after you all spent years praising his strength. So instead, he found a different way to repay the debt he believed he owed. Her voice trembled slightly as she spoke the next words. "He began gifting assets into a private portfolio, quietly, over years. He insisted. I tried to refuse. I didn't want his money, Nathan. I never asked for any of this. But he needed to believe he had balanced the scales." Tears burned behind my eyes. "But why didn't he tell us?" "Because you never allowed him to be imperfect," she said softly. "He was terrified that if you saw his weakness, you'd see him differently. You all needed him to be invincible, and so he buried that part of himself with me." The silence in the room was deafening. My entire understanding of my grandfather was dissolving before my eyes, not into something evil, but into something painfully human. She looked down for a moment, then raised her eyes to meet mine again. "Your grandfather wasn't manipulated. He wasn't tricked. He was ashamed, and I was simply the only person he trusted to see that part of him." I sat there, unable to speak, my chest tight. For years we had worshipped him as flawless, and in doing so, we had made it impossible for him to show us who he really was. The price of his silence was now tearing our family apart. And Claire Donovan, she wasn't the villain. She was the only one he trusted with the truth. When I left Claire's house that evening, my mind was spinning. I replayed every word she had spoken, every expression on her face, every tremble in her voice. She hadn't defended herself. She hadn't asked for sympathy. She had simply told the truth, a truth so devastatingly simple it was unbearable. My grandfather had been broken once, and instead of turning to his family, he turned to her. Not because he loved her more, but because we never gave him permission to be anything less than perfect. But I knew exactly what was waiting for me back at the estate. The truth would never be enough for my family. They weren't looking for explanations. They were hunting for someone to blame. The moment I walked through the grand wooden doors, their voices collided in a storm of anger. "She's lying," my uncle shouted. "She manipulated him," another barked. "She preyed on his shame," my aunt sobbed. I stood silently, watching as they unraveled. Their faces twisted with rage, not at her, but at the collapse of their fantasy. "She wasn't even part of this family," my cousin spat. "Who the hell does she think she is?" I finally spoke, my voice calm but sharp. "She was the only person who saw him when he was falling, the only one who let him confess his weakness. Because she planned it that way," my uncle sneered. "Don't you see? She made herself indispensable so she could take everything." I shook my head. "She never asked for anything. He made those choices." "You're naive," my father said coldly. "No man gives away that much without being coerced." "No man," I whispered. "Or no God." The room fell quiet. "You never wanted him to be human," I continued. "You built your lives around the myth of his perfection. But the truth is, he was terrified. Not of losing money, but of losing your admiration. So he carried his shame in silence, because he didn't believe any of you could forgive him for failing." My father's eyes narrowed, his voice lowering to a dangerous calm. "We gave him everything." "No," I replied, my voice cracking. "He gave us everything. And when he needed someone to see him fully, he chose her. Not because she stole him, because we never saw him." The silence that followed was heavy, but I knew I had crossed an invisible line. This wasn't just about inheritance anymore. This was about pride, and wounded pride has a way of devouring logic. "We're filing the lawsuit," my uncle declared. "We're not letting that woman walk away with what's ours." I stared at them, stunned. "After everything I just told you? She's not walking away with my father's legacy," my cousin shouted. I could see it clearly now. Their rage wasn't fueled by justice. It was fueled by the unbearable reality that they weren't the center of his most private world. The attorneys were already preparing filings. Press contacts were activated. The plan was clear: paint Claire Donovan as a cunning predator who exploited a powerful man's moment of weakness. They would use the media, public sympathy, and legal manipulation to destroy her, not because they truly believed she deserved it, but because they couldn't live with the humiliation of being excluded from his final truth. And as their machines roared to life, I realized something chilling. They weren't trying to defend my grandfather's legacy. They were trying to defend their illusion. The media circus erupted faster than even I expected. Within 48 hours of the lawsuit being filed, headlines screamed across every major outlet. "Secret beneficiary steals billionaire's hidden fortune." "Mysterious woman manipulates powerful family." "Scandal erupts after patriarchs." "Death." Cameras camped outside the estate. Reporters stalked Claire's quiet neighborhood. Talk shows speculated endlessly about who she was, painting grotesque narratives of seduction, blackmail, and betrayal. And through it all, Claire remained silent. Not a single interview. No public statement. She refused every attempt to pull her into the circus. I visited her several times during those first weeks, entering quietly through her back alley, careful to avoid the swarm of journalists desperate for a glimpse of her. Each time I saw her, she looked smaller, not defeated but tired, worn down by the weight of carrying my grandfather's secret through a new kind of storm. "You don't deserve this," I told her one evening as we sat in her dimly lit living room, the muffled sounds of reporters still audible outside. She smiled faintly, but her voice was steady. "Neither did he, Nathan. But sometimes the cost of protecting someone you love is greater than you expect. They're tearing you apart." Her eyes glistened. "I carried his shame for 20 years. I can carry this a little longer." I felt something heavy rise in my throat. I wanted to protect her, to fix this, but I was powerless. The trial began 3 months later. The courtroom was packed. Reporters, attorneys, family members, cameras. My uncles sat proudly with their legal team, armed with a strategy built not on facts, but on spectacle. They argued emotional manipulation, claiming my grandfather was coerced in his old age, isolated from his family, emotionally dependent on Claire. They paraded expert witnesses, psychologists who had never met him but speculated about cognitive decline. Former business partners subtly encouraged doubt. Carefully curated fragments of private conversations were twisted into sinister narratives, and every day, Claire sat silently at the defense table, composed, dignified, enduring every dagger thrown, her way without breaking. I was called to testify midway through the proceedings. As I took the stand, I felt every pair of eyes drilling into me. My family's glare was burning with betrayal. The prosecution's attorney smiled with thinly veiled condescension. "Mr. Whitmore," he began, "your grandfather was a proud, powerful man, was he not?" "Yes," I answered. "And would you say he valued control above all else?" "Yes." "Then isn't it reasonable to assume that losing control in his later years made him vulnerable to influence?" I paused, choosing my words carefully. He wasn't afraid of losing control over his wealth. He was afraid of losing control over how we saw him. The attorney blinked, thrown off by my answer. "Please elaborate." "He didn't fear financial collapse. He feared collapsing in front of us. We worshipped his perfection for decades. But perfection is a prison, and when he finally stumbled, he found someone outside the family who let him be weak, who saw him as a man, not as a monument." The courtroom was still. The judge scribbled notes. My father clenched his jaw. The attorney pressed on. "And yet, despite this so-called friendship, she accepted millions of dollars." I nodded slowly. "Yes, because he insisted. Because he believed he was repaying a debt he couldn't carry emotionally." The attorney's voice sharpened. "Or because she manipulated him into believing he owed her." I looked directly at him, my voice steady. "If you had met her, you'd know she was the only person in his entire life who allowed him to confess his failure without judgment. My grandfather wasn't stolen from. He gave freely because shame can be heavier than any fortune." The attorney stumbled briefly, then shifted his line of questioning. But I saw the cracks spreading. As the weeks dragged on, the media shifted too. Reporters began questioning the family's motives. Public sympathy leaned unexpectedly toward Claire. The more vicious my uncles became, the more human she appeared. The narrative they tried so hard to control was slipping. But I knew the real verdict wouldn't come from public opinion. It would come from the judge, and it was coming soon. The final days of the trial felt heavier than the rest. The courtroom air grew thicker. Every pause stretched longer. Every glance carried weight. My family's attorneys grew more desperate as the public narrative shifted steadily out of their control. What began as confident arrogance was now bitter frustration. They had expected a simple victory, convinced the court that Claire had preyed on an aging man, paint her as a manipulative outsider, and walk away with the entire fortune, restored to its rightful heirs. But reality was slipping through their fingers. Claire's defense remained steady. Her lawyers presented every financial record with precision. Each transfer was documented, authorized, and notarized. No hidden threats, no secret leverage. Only a long, quiet trail of voluntary gifts. Gifts born not from manipulation, but from my grandfather's guilt. By the time closing arguments began, even the media's tone had shifted. The headlines no longer screamed scandal. They whispered tragedy. A family so consumed by preserving a myth that they couldn't bear to see the human man behind it. The prosecution's final statement dripped with desperation. "Your Honor," their lead attorney began, voice sharp and rehearsed, "we are not simply discussing legal transfers. We are discussing emotional dependency." This woman positioned herself at the center of Mr. Whitmore's private life, isolating him from his family, feeding off his fear of failure. While the transfers were signed voluntarily, the emotional manipulation driving those decisions cannot be ignored. This was exploitation, not generosity. He paused dramatically, letting his words settle in the air. "We do not challenge that Mr. Whitmore was proud, powerful, and brilliant. But even the strongest men can fall prey to quiet, calculated influence. And that, Your Honor, is exactly what occurred." My uncles nodded in unison, clutching the last threads of their narrative. My father sat rigid, face tight, eyes burning. Then Claire's attorney rose. His voice was calm, measured, no theatrics, no venom. "Your Honor," he began, "this case is not about fraud. It is not about deception. It is about shame. A man burdened by the weight of his own legend found comfort in a friendship that allowed him to confess his imperfection without consequence. Miss Donovan did not seek his fortune. She carried his secret because he needed someone to carry it. The financial transfers were not payment for manipulation. They were attempts, his attempts to balance a debt only he believed existed." The courtroom was silent. The judge sat unmoving, hands folded. "Families often worship their heroes so completely," the attorney continued, "that they leave no space for those heroes to fail. And so, when failure comes, it must be hidden, buried, outsourced to those who are willing to bear it." He turned toward my family's table. "The real question is not why he trusted Miss Donovan. The real question is why he couldn't trust his own blood." The words sliced through the room like a knife. The judge adjourned, announcing that his ruling would be delivered in 72 hours. As we filed out of the courtroom, the reporters swarmed, microphones, flashing lights. My uncles issued carefully rehearsed statements. My father refused to speak. My cousins smiled for cameras while feeding the narrative of betrayal. But Claire slipped quietly through a side exit, protected by her attorneys, her silence once again, her only defense. I found her outside waiting by her car away from the crowd. "They'll never forgive you," I said softly. She smiled gently. "They were never angry with me, Nathan. They were angry with him, but they can't scream at a ghost." The weight of those words crushed me. The ghost she spoke of wasn't just my grandfather. It was the perfect version of him we had all clung to. And now, standing in ruins, none of us knew how to face what he really was, a brilliant, broken man who carried his shame in secret, and Claire had been the only one who let him set that burden down. The morning of the verdict arrived. Under a heavy gray sky, it felt as though even the weather recognized the weight of what was about to unfold. The courthouse steps were already swarming with reporters and flashing cameras long before we arrived. The world was watching, but none of them truly understood what was at stake. This wasn't about wealth anymore. This was about who we had been forced to become in his absence. Inside the courtroom, the air was suffocating. My uncles sat rigid, clutching their final hopes in clenched fists. My cousins wore thin masks of confidence. My father remained stone still, his breathing shallow, eyes locked forward. Claire sat at her table, quiet as always, hands folded in, her lap, her face unreadable. The judge entered. We all stood. The gavel struck, and the room fell silent. He cleared his throat, adjusting his glasses, and began reading the verdict. His voice was steady, but each word landed with force. "This court has reviewed the extensive testimony, documentation, and arguments presented. At the center of this case lies not only a financial dispute, but a profound emotional tragedy. The plaintiffs argue emotional manipulation, coercion, and exploitation of an aging man. The defense argues voluntary agency, personal autonomy, and long-standing friendship." He paused, scanning both sides of the room. While Mr. Whitmore concealed these transactions from his family, there exists no credible evidence, either financial or psychological, that suggests these transfers were made under duress, blackmail, or diminished capacity. A ripple moved through the courtroom. My uncle's jaw clenched. My cousin gripped the bench so tightly his knuckles whitened. The judge continued, voice unwavering. "The court finds that Mr. Whitmore's actions, while privately concealed, were executed with full legal authority and capacity. The financial transfers made to Miss Donovan were lawful, voluntary, and binding. The plaintiff's petition to reverse these transfers is hereby denied." 3 words followed that echoed like a thunderclap in the room. "Case dismissed, permanently." The gavel struck again, and just like that, it was over. The silence that followed was louder than the verdict itself. My uncles collapsed into their chairs, stunned. My father remained frozen, his expression unreadable, though I could feel the storm raging behind his hollow stare. My cousins exchanged panicked glances, desperate to salvage dignity in front of the cameras that waited outside. And then there was Claire. She didn't smile. She didn't celebrate. She simply lowered her head for a moment, closing her eyes as though releasing a breath she had held for years. I watched her, feeling something shift inside me, a mixture of sorrow and admiration. She hadn't won. She had simply survived. Outside, the media frenzy reignited. Reporters screamed questions. Flashbulbs exploded. Statements were demanded. My uncles issued bitter declarations of injustice. My cousins repeated tired lines about betrayal. But Claire, as always, slipped quietly through the crowd, untouched by their noise, carrying her grace like a shield. Later that evening, I found her sitting quietly in the small garden behind her house. She was sipping tea, staring at the fading light of dusk. "It's done," I said softly. She nodded, but her voice remained steady. "It was never really about winning or losing, Nathan." "Then what was it about?" She looked up at me, her eyes shining with exhausted clarity. "It was about protecting the part of him he couldn't share with anyone else. And now, maybe that part can finally rest." I sat beside her, the silence between us heavy but peaceful. In the distance, the last rays of sunlight disappeared behind the trees. The storm was over. But the scars it left behind would remain for all of us, etched into a legacy built not on money, but on the unbearable cost of silence. And in that moment, I finally saw my grandfather clearly. Not as the man on the pedestal, not as the flawless patriarch, but as what he always was beneath it all, a man terrified of falling in front of those who loved him most. In the weeks that followed, the noise faded, but the fracture within my family remained raw. We no longer gathered like we used to. The grand estate that once pulsed with celebration now felt like a hollow monument to something broken beyond repair. My uncles retreated into silence, avoiding each other in public while maintaining their polite veneers. My cousins whispered behind closed doors, searching for new ways to justify what had happened, not to the world, but to themselves. My father changed most of all. He moved like a man haunted by ghosts he couldn't confront. The truth had shattered something inside him, not because he lost money, but because he lost the illusion that his father had always been untouchable. The man he had spent his life chasing approval from had carried shame he was never allowed to share, and now my father was left staring at a reflection of his own failures, not just as a son, but as a man who had never allowed his father to be anything less than perfect. I visited Claire one final time before she left town. She had sold her house quietly, donated much of the inheritance to causes my grandfather once privately supported, but never publicly endorsed. Scholarships for children who would never know his name. Grants for small businesses on the brink of collapse. Men and women standing where he once stood, desperate for redemption. We sat on her porch as the early evening sun bathed the garden in soft gold. There was a peace in her now that hadn't been there before. A peace born, not of victory, but of release. "You could have kept it all," I said softly. She smiled, shaking her head. "And what would that have given me, Nathan? The money was never the weight. The secret was." I studied her face, trying to grasp the depth of grace it took to carry someone else's shame for so long. "Do you hate them?" I asked. "No," she answered without hesitation. "They're angry because they never saw him fall. They built their identity on his strength. But strength without vulnerability isn't real. It's performance. And when that performance cracks, people lash out." I lowered my gaze. "He should have trusted us." She turned to me, her eyes kind but unwavering. "He wanted to. But sometimes the people closest to us are the ones we fear disappointing the most. We hold them so high that they become trapped by the very love meant to protect them." The breeze rustled softly through the trees. In the fading light, I saw my grandfather's entire life differently. Not as a titan who conquered, but as a man who carried the unbearable weight of never being allowed to stumble. "Do you think he's at peace now?" I whispered. She closed her eyes briefly, then opened them with a faint smile. "I hope so, But peace isn't always for the one who leaves, Nathan. Sometimes it's for the ones left behind, if they're brave enough to stop chasing the illusion. The next morning, she was gone. No announcements, no farewells. Just the quiet closing of a chapter that was never meant to be written. Weeks later, I stood alone before my grandfather's grave. The marble stone gleamed under the soft morning sun, his name etched boldly into the surface, a name that carried so much weight, both in life and in death. I ran my fingers gently over the cold letters, my voice barely a whisper as the words escaped me. I forgive you. And in that fragile moment of honesty, I finally understood what forgiveness truly was. Not absolution for the secret, but acceptance of the man beneath the myth. He wasn't perfect. He was human. And perhaps, in the end, that was enough.